Welcome to RNG Girls, a podcast on the people, projects and politics of renewable natural gas. I'm Lisa Kitt, founder of RNG Girls and managing director of Dahlia Recruitment. Our podcast aims to bring you the latest insights in the RNG market by sitting down with the key players who are shaping the industry, from operators and developers to investors and policy leaders. Joining me as my co-host is the brilliant Skye Austin. She's the sales director for StarkTech's RNG and compression division and co-vice chair of American Biogas Council. Together, we'll explore what's being built, what's being funded, and what it really takes to deliver projects in the real world. Please stay tuned for our regular episodes, and let's keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in renewable natural gas. Welcome back to the RNG Girls podcast, where we talk with the people shaping the future of biogas and renewable natural gas. I'm Lisa Kitt. I'm the founder of Dahlia Recruitment, where I connect the biogas industry to top talent.
And I'm Skye Austin, Vice Chair of the American Biogas Council and Sales Director with StarkTech, where we engineer and fabricate gas upgrading systems that take biogas from creation and capture all the way to pipeline quality RNG. One of the things I've realized over the past few years is that most of us in the industry spend a lot of time talking about digesters and landfill gas, membranes, compressors, NRUs, carbon intensity, CO2 capture, fertilizer markets, SAF, marine fuel. We spend a lot of time talking about how to build projects and where those molecules are ultimately going. But the reality is the best project in the world would never produce a molecule of RNG if it can't get funded. And if I'm being honest, that's an area where I've become increasingly curious. At Stark, we often enter the conversation after a project has already gained momentum. But I really want to explore with the audience today is what happens before that point. What makes investors say yes? What makes lenders comfortable? And why do some projects attract capital while others struggle? Before we jump in, I'll admit something. When I first entered this industry as a developer, I thought the hard part was building the plant. And then I thought it was the feedstock agreements and getting so many farmers to get on the same page. And then I thought the hard part was the permitting. And then I thought the hard part was getting an interconnect. And now I'm not entirely convinced that the hardest part of all isn't convincing someone to write a check for the whole darn thing. So I'm excited for this conversation today because I suspect a lot of our listeners are in the same boat.
Great. That's exactly what we're discussing today, because every RNG project eventually comes down to the same question. Can you convince enough people that this project is worth investing in?
To help us answer that question, we're joined by two people who spend their careers helping projects navigate capital, risk, growth, and market strategy. Chris Negus brings an extensive experience in commercial lending, project finance, M&A within the biogas sector, helping facilitate more than $160 million in debt financing and advising over $400 million in transactions. And Andrew Rice, more than a decade of commercial banking and relationship management experience, helping businesses navigate changing markets, refinancing opportunities, growth strategies, and challenging economic cycles. Chris, Andrew, welcome to the RNG Girls podcast.
Lovely to see you both. Thanks for having us.
Well, Chris, let's start simple. When people hear the word project finance, their eyes usually glaze over, or at least mine do. But the reality is it doesn't matter how robust the technology is and how low the CI score becomes or how compelling the environmental story might be. Those remain ideas instead of infrastructure if they can't get funded. How do you explain project finance to someone outside the finance world?
Yes, certainly, Skye. So project finance is very much delivered on a singular project via a special purpose vehicle, as opposed to corporate finance, which is when an investor will back a platform or a particular company by injecting capital into that project. Project finance will be done on purely an individual project basis.
So most people assume that project finance is simply about finding money, but it feels like it's really about building confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. From our side of things, the biggest thing is finding a team that is bankable more than necessarily the project, because the lenders have got to have conviction that the team behind it are also capable of not only bringing in those key points that you were mentioning, Skye, the feedstock, the interconnect, but actually then delivering that project, or at least overseeing a team of people that can deliver that project. You've got various parts within project finance. You're talking about someone giving debt into the project, so typically a bank, or it could be private activity bonds, for example. And then you've got the equity portion, which is someone with more of a direct ownership into the stakes. And that could either be a development platform, so some of the big ones that we see in the market currently, or it could be an individual financing company coming into that SPV, and typically they'll want to take a majority stake within that project. So you've got to be able to convince the people that are writing these checks that your team can deliver exactly what you're saying on the tin. From our side of things, that is very much the confidence that you need to build when speaking to lenders. It's not just about coming to them with a good CI score, but it's convincing them the numbers in your model, for example, the strength of your contracts, the investment memorandum you're putting forward is the right one for them, because these lenders are seeing hundreds of deals a month, 100 deals a year. And so you need to really stand out with something that shows that you are the team to be backing.
Yeah, since it's a vote on confidence, what are some of the things that makes a team compelling to a lender?
So certainly their experience within the sector. You've got to have a team that has that experience and has a breadth of ability as well. So covering not just finance, but operations, engineering, the commercial side of things. Don't necessarily need to have someone internal that's of a legal mind, but a strong legal representative, strong counsel that know what they're doing in the sector is always advantageous as well. How you're going to operate it. So from my standpoint, and I apologise to all farmers now, but I would never let a farmer operate a digester. I'd always want either my internal team that's experienced or an experienced external counterparty to come in and do it, because that ultimately is how you're going to be generating the predictable cash flow that your model is attesting to, and ultimately how they get their money back. So I think that is sort of the real things that we'd be looking to build that confidence in within the team.
Andrew, you've spent decades building client relationships through multiple economic cycles. How much is successful project financing numbers and how much is trust?
Well, what I would say is people assume project finance is 80% numbers. In my experience, is 80% trust. And the numbers are kind of the language you use to express that trust. When we think back to downturns, economic cycles, the downturns that have happened in the past, so 2008, for example, COVID is another example. The point with those is that when markets turn, as they did in those two examples, the deals that held together weren't the ones with the prettiest, fluffiest models. They were the ones where every party at the table believed that others would pick up the phone at 6 a.m. when something went wrong. Just to elaborate on that, I think it's important to distinguish the two roles that numbers play. At an early stage, numbers are the entry ticket. Lenders and sponsors need to see that the model works. Whereas at a late stage, or in the event of some sort of crisis happening, numbers become the negotiating language. But whether you reach a negotiated solution or not, I guess really depends entirely on the relationship. I would say trust in project finance means three things, essentially. Predictability, candor, and memory. So just to elaborate on those three, it's a question of, would you do what you said? Would you tell me bad news early? And do you remember that I helped you back in 2008 or whatever time it was? In closing to that question, I would just say anyone can build a relationship in a bull market. The real test is who calls you first when the project hits trouble, and who you call. That list doesn't come from a good pitch deck. It comes from doing what you said you do.
Yeah, so I think transparency is one of those key elements to building trust with the team behind a project.
Oh, absolutely, Skye. I mean, I think transparency and that trust is fundamental in getting projects sort of banked in this market. We've seen developers sort of trying to rename existing CI reports to get off takes and all sorts of things. And we are very firm that no, it has to be the CI report for that project. And we will actually go and check with the people that have written the CI report. We don't allow those sort of practices because of everything that Andrew just said there. We want to deal with people that are open and transparent and trustworthy in this market, because that's where the good projects get built ultimately.
So let's imagine two RNG projects. We've got the same feedstock, same tech, same projected production. One gets funded, one doesn't. Chris, why?
So really it comes down to the feedstock structuring, the security of that feedstock, the tenor of the contracts versus the loan or the lending agreements. You always want to have those contracts being slightly longer than the financial arrangements to give a tail for the next investor to be able to pick up. You actually want that as a developer as well, because it will make that next conversation a lot easier. It's around the offtake agreements, exactly the same, and the credit worthiness of those offtake partners. We are seeing and getting asked a lot more around investment grade ratings and having to do a lot more along the S&P ratings and the Fitch ratings, and that's something we actually include in our IMs when we're going out on new projects. Those sort of financial metrics, especially given Andrew and I's backgrounds, that then links into that revenue certainty, because an off-taker that's got, say, a investment grade credit rating behind it is going to be offering a lot more certainty to a investor than someone that isn't. That's quite frank. There's blips that happen, but I think, as a general rule, you want a investment grade credit party. And then you've got the counterparty strengths. So things like the O&M contract that was just saying, have they got experience? Do they know what they're doing? I would say that's also fundamental when it comes to your technology partners, your EPC companies. Like, as long as they can point to a track record, great. I've seen projects where, people are willing to write checks of up of 150 million, and you say to them, okay, so what experience have they got in the sector? Oh, no, they haven't done anything here, but they've done solar projects previously. Well, it's not comparing apples and apples, as we say, this side of the pond. So that is very much how it involves from the third parties. But then you've got to have that sponsor experience as well, as we were sort of talking about earlier, that whether it's you as a developer and you've done it before, or you've worked in a company that's done before, there will be so much weight put on the ability of the people sponsoring the projects. Some of the projects that we've worked on haven't got a hope in hell of getting financed because of their experience, and actually we've come in and helped them with that experience piece and then got them to being funded. And that's not only on a financing level, that's also on sort of state and regulatory levels as well, that these parties need to build confidence and buy into what you're doing, especially in the United States. We've seen that is a fundamental win when it comes to doing projects. So yeah, in answer to your question, Lisa, all around strength of counterparties, credit worthiness, and then the experience of both the people building the project, but actually the people that are sponsoring the project and putting it forward.
So understanding that investors seem to hate surprises, and how do you actually balance that with the fact that we are in an industry that is high risk, high reward?
It really is. So from my standpoint, it's really important to highlight those risks early, but then show the mitigants that you can put in there to minimize those risks. Investors will understand that there'll be things that will happen. What I'm trying to think, for example, like there's always going to be an item, like you can't predict the weather, for example. You don't know if there's going to be a flood or a lightning storm, stuff like that, but you can put the lightning protection in, for example. So you can always put in things that will mitigate that risk, not completely eliminate it, but certainly reduce the impact of that risk coming to you. So from our standpoint, our advice would be call out those risks early, but show how you're mitigating it. Have a backup plan for, your feedstock partner going bankrupt, and you know that there's more than enough feedstock in the area. We always actually work on not securing, but developing projects where there's about 300% of the actual volume required, just to show that if this party goes, we've still got another two parties over here that can supply the same amount of feedstock to us.
Right. So we're recording this during a period where developers are navigating policy uncertainty, volatile environmental credit markets, changing incentive structures, and a fair amount of economic uncertainty. Are lenders becoming more cautious, or are they simply becoming more selective?
I would actually say it's probably an element of both. That they are certainly more cautious, especially in the RNG sector. That they are becoming a lot more cautious. I think there's been some experience where lenders have been badly burnt and lost money, sadly, and that is often the characteristic of people chasing high environmental policy and credits. We've seen that in the UK, Andrew. I think it's fair to say back in the day with high prices in electricity generation, the early gas generation, and you see a lot of developers, prick their ears up and go and think they're going to make a quick buck. And sadly, I think it's symptomatic of where the high LCFS prices were a couple of years ago. And I do regrettably feel there's going to be a number of projects coming to market that have been built on those numbers and ultimately failed because they haven't hit it, they haven't secured it. But back in the day, they managed to do it. And this isn't only symptomatic of RNG. You've only got to look at things like the mortgage crises in the past. It is actually a foil of the finance industry trying to get better returns and not necessarily boxing off every part of it. And we're just going through our particular part of the lending environment and volatility in that currently, Asa. But I do think they are becoming more selective because of that as well. Where they've then been burnt, they're then wanting to put all of these mitigants, this sponsor experience, the bankability of those partners in place a lot earlier in the process. They're wanting to be involved earlier as well. That's one thing I would certainly say is, don't leave your financing to the last minute. Get the investors involved early doors and they can help shape the project to be what they know they all need to get through their investment committee. Because that is ultimately the people you've got to impress here. It's not even necessarily the business development person that you speak to first of all. It's the people sitting behind the office doors that are looking at the spreadsheets, making the investment decisions. They're the people that have got to be buying into this, and they are the ones that are becoming more selective. We've seen governmental changes cited as some of the reasons why people are becoming more selective. Having actually spoken to both governments, both sides of the pond, I would say that's a little bit of an excuse. From our experience, the current administration in the US is actually quite supportive of RNG, having large-scale investment in rural communities. We've seen them to be saying, yeah, okay, we don't mind you so much. And this side of the pond, I think there's always going to be a case for biomethane. It's just a need to get it into people's mindsets a bit more and maybe look at alternatives of it rather than just putting it into the pipeline. But yeah, I would say it's a 50-50 split at least. More cautious because of bad experiences, but then becoming more selective because they realise, there are better projects now coming to the market.
Yeah. What are the first three things that you look at when evaluating a project?
So for me, it's feedstock security, strength of the technology partner, and strength of the operator. As I said, you want to have an abundance of feedstock in the area. You don't want to be taking up every single ton of feedstock and leaving nothing just in case there's something that goes wrong. You want a technology partner that knows what they're doing. They've got experience. They've got projects built either in that country or globally. And then operational wise, as I said, I would never let a farmer operate one of these. They are, I don't want to say they're too technical. I don't mean to be disrespectful to farmers, but it's not just a mechanical process. It's biological. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to RNG projects. And my biggest advice would be that if you haven't got an internal operations team, hire an external one that is experienced.
Yeah, luckily Abda isn't until next week, and this recording will go out after that. So if there's any angry farmers listening to it, you won't have to run.
It's okay, Lisa. I can always I can justify why we feel this way.
So when you think about like the biggest red flags, I think you talked about some of them, but what ultimately puts a project into the too risky category?
Yeah, certainly. So for me, it's not having answers to those easy questions of like, where's your revenue stack? Where's your operational side of things? Also, a massive red flag for me is an overly complicated financial model. One where you click into it and cells just loop background to each other and you can't follow it back to its original source. It immediately makes me think that something's being hidden here, and therefore it sort of breaks down that trust and transparency element from the outside. You have to make sure a financial model covers what you need, but it doesn't need to be smoke and mirrors. You should be able to get to the source data in there with relative ease. I've seen spreadsheets where you end up sort of going round and round in circles and coming back to the original cell you clicked on, and you're still none the wiser of what that original input was, and that's a massive red flag for me.
Yeah. Andrew, you've helped companies through refinancing and restructuring situations, though. What do struggling projects typically have in common?
Well, I think the surprising thing is struggling projects rarely fail because of one single catastrophic event. They fail because of a series of small decisions that nobody flagged up early enough, and the warning signs when you look at it were always there. I mean, just to break that down a little bit further for you, I mean, first example, the model was built to win approval, but not to survive reality. And there's always a tendency amongst project owners to, and especially in competitive bid situations, is to sharpen assumptions to win the mandate. Optimistic construction timelines are there, traffic forecasts that assume everything is going to be bright and rosy. And by the time the project hits trouble, the lender is looking at numbers that were, I hate to say it, never really that honest. The other thing I would say is the sponsor and the lender stop talking candidly to each other. And this is an area which tends to kill a deal off quite quietly. And what I mean by that is early in a project, communication is excellent. Then something goes slightly off kilter, slightly off plan. And instead of an early conversation, the sponsor starts managing the narrative. So by the time the lender really understands the problem, the options are much narrower than they should have been. And it's an age-old question of, well, bad news doesn't get better with age sort of thing. Nobody owning the problem. I mean, in complex project finance structures, multiple lenders, equity partners, contractors, off-takers, it's very easy for everyone to assume someone else is watching the critical risk. I've seen it in restructurings. I often found that the project has had warning signs going on for 12, maybe as long as 18 months, that have sat in reports that nobody's actually acted on. And I think the thing I would probably close with is the capital structure has no room for error. Something that Chris has already alluded to, but projects are often financed right to the edge of what the numbers support. And that's fine. That's lovely in very benign conditions. But the ones that struggle usually have no liquidity buffer. There's no flexibility in covenants, no room to absorb a 6-month construction delay or an energy price move. Resilience, sometimes we see it gets value engineered out, is the way I would say it. I think what I've learned after doing this for longer than I care to remember is that technical and financial problems are usually solvable. What makes a restructuring genuinely hard is when trust has broken down between the parties, because then every conversation is adversarial. It can be. Every number is disputed. Solutions that take weeks, take months. The whole process becomes elongated. The projects that come through restructuring well are the ones where, even under enormous stress, the key people still believe each other are acting in good faith.
Yeah, so what's the difference between a project that successfully course corrects and navigates those kind of challenges and one that ultimately fails?
After being in rooms where projects have been saved and rooms where they couldn't be and they've gone beyond the point of no return, the difference is rarely what's on any spreadsheet. The spreadsheet tells you the scale of the problem, but it almost never tells you whether the project is going to survive or not. I think the first thing to point out is speed of acknowledgement, getting to that first fork in the road. The single biggest differentiator I've seen is how quickly the key people acknowledge that there's a problem, not to the market in terms of an outbound message, not inwardly to the board, but just to themselves. Projects that survive have sponsors and teams who can look at deteriorating data and say, this is real and we need to act now. The ones that fail inevitably spend 6, 9, 12 months, maybe even longer, convincing themselves that something is temporary. By the time they accept the reality, the options have gone, certainly. I think the other thing to look at is leadership under pressure. when leadership is under pressure, character often reveals itself. Challenges strip away the veneer very quickly. In the good times, almost everyone looks like a good leader. But when a project is in distress, when lenders are nervous, contractors are claiming cash is tight, you find out very fast who people really are. From my experience, the projects that come through have someone at the center who can hold their nerve, make clear decisions sometimes with incomplete information, and just keep people moving in the same direction. That is a quality that is rarer than any financial skill. I think the other thing I would say is in terms of relationship capital, get it built before it's needed. Because this is something, it's not a thing that you can manufacture in a crisis. The projects that navigate difficulty well almost always have a sponsor or a team that has built genuine trust with their lenders and partners over time before anything went wrong. So when they pick up the phone and say, we have a problem and here's what we're going to do about it, people listen and lean in and go, oh, okay. And the conversation is a bit easier. The ones that fail are often calling lenders they've never really invested in. And then that conversation does tend to go very differently, certainly a lot more awkwardly. I think the final thing I would just set out is the issue of collective problem solving versus collective self-protection. I've seen that when a project hits serious trouble, you get one of two dynamics around the table. Either people roll up their sleeves and say, right, how do we solve this together? Or everyone just retreats to their legal position as much as anything and starts protecting themselves. Once you're in the second dynamic, it's extraordinarily hard to get back to the first dynamic. And the projects that survive find a way to keep people in solution mode. And that usually comes down to one or two individuals who have the credibility and the relationships to hold the room together. I think the other thing I would say is flexibility versus rigidity. It's all about the thinking, not just the structure. Projects that fail are often trapped, and they're trapped in the original plan. Sometimes trapped because there's no plan B necessarily. They're trapped in assumptions nobody wants to revisit. They're trapped in a capital structure with no flexibility. The ones that survive are willing to ask hard questions. Do we need new equity? Do we need to renegotiate the offtake? Do we need a different operator? Survival will often require a willingness to let go of how you thought this was going to work and focus entirely on what needs to be true for it to work at all. And I think if I had to distill it into one thing, and this may sound incredibly simple, it's whether the people involved believe the project is worth saving and are willing to be honest with each other about what that actually requires. I've seen projects with ghastly problems survive because of that belief and that honesty. And I've seen projects with manageable problems fail because neither was present. So I think in the end, it's always a human story.
One of the things that we've explored repeatedly on this podcast is that our industry is filled with incredibly smart technical people. But being technically right and being investable aren't always the same thing. Chris, can a technically sound project still be unfinanceable?
Sadly, yes, Guy. It's quite easy for a technically sound project still to be uninvestable, and that's why we're taking some of the educational steps that we are with our masterclass to sort of try and bring those bits to the forefront. So, for example, no creditworthy long-term offtakes, unhedged merchant exposure, pricing tied to volatile or uncertain markets can make a project be uninvestable. One thing we talked about previously, weak or unrated off-takers, EPC contractors with no balance sheet to stand behind the wraps, or sponsors with no track record or skin in the game. Simply that the investor's rate of return doesn't clear the hurdle that they require, and it's technically fine, but financially unremarkable, I think, is probably a fair way of putting it. Permitting, land interconnection, all of those sort of things, queue positions year out for your green connections, or unresolved planning and zoning, that can kill an otherwise sound project. Policy and regulatory dependency. If you're looking at potentially politically fragile parts of the revenue stack, that can have a massive impact, and often investors will completely discount those from the project, therefore making that investment rate of return even harder to attract. The bankability of contracts. So as we're speaking about term mismatches between the debt tenor and your tenor of your offtake or your feedstock, inadequate availability guarantees, missing in step-in rights or weak security packages. Scale and ticket size is often something that we come across as well. It's either too small to absorb diligence and structuring costs, or it's simply too large for the available capital pool, and the structuring of the capital can then become very complex. There could be unclear ownership, unresolved joint venture economics, tax structuring that doesn't allow the transfer of credits cleanly in the United States, or a development stage too early for the capital being sought. And finally, market timing and sentiment. This is a sound assessment. If a particular sector is out of favor, or it's becoming harder because of been noted issues and failures, then that can have a massive impact when you're going to do your project. From our side of things, it's a judgment that lives almost entirely outside of the engineering side of things. The most common failure mode is a sponsor who has solved the technical risk, but has just assumed the commercial, the contractual, and the financing risk would follow thereafterwards.
Andrew, what's the one thing that developers consistently underestimate when they're trying to raise capital?
To be honest with you, I'd have to say it's the relationship. It's not the quality of the relationship, the length of it. Developers consistently underestimate how early the relationship with capital needs to start. Being completely honest with you, this is something we see time and time and time again. They arrive too late. So the most common mistake I see, and I've seen it across every market cycle, is the developer who has a genuinely good project, solid team, credible plan. They come to market 6 months before they need the money, and they're surprised when it takes longer than expected. Capital decisions at scale are not transactional, and that is probably the single biggest misconception that I see. Lenders and equity partners they're not evaluating your project in isolation. They're evaluating whether they trust you enough to be in a long-term relationship with you. And that assessment takes time, and you can't just compress it by having better slides and better presentations. So I think of everything that we talk about today, I think that's one of probably the biggest things, if not the very biggest thing for developers to be considering. We often see they optimize the pitch instead of the relationship. So there's an enormous amount of energy that goes into the information memorandum, the financial model, the presentation. And don't get me wrong, I mean, all of that matters. But I've watched developers spend months and months perfecting their deck and weeks on their investor relationships, when it should be the other way around. By the time you're formally pitching, the people across the table should really already know you. The pitch is just purely, what's the word I'm looking for? It's purely just a confirmation of what they already believe. It's not a stage where they're introducing it. They underestimate what investors are actually evaluating. So when a sophisticated investor is sitting across from a developer, they're running two parallel assessments. One is the project, the numbers, the site, the planning, the market. The other is the person. Can I trust the person with my capital over a 10 or a 15-year horizon? Will they tell me bad news early? Have they done this before? How do they behave when the times got hard, when the going got tough? That second assessment carries enormous weight, and it can be answered in a single meeting. It requires time and consistency and a track record of small interactions to help build up that confidence. The other thing I would say is they treat early conversations as premature. I often hear developers say, we're not ready to go to investors yet. We want to have more of the project de-risk first. Now, I understand that instinct, but it's often the wrong call. You don't need to be raising to be in conversation. Some of the most valuable capital relationships I've seen were built over 2, sometimes 3 years of informal dialogue, sharing progress, I should say, asking for perspective, keeping people close to the journey. By the time the raise happens, it's almost, what's the word I'm looking for now? It almost wasn't a pitch at all. It was almost like an invitation, to be honest with you. I think the mental model I would encourage every developer to adopt is Your capital raise doesn't start when you go to market. It starts the day you decide you're going to build something. Every conversation between now and the close is either building the trust that makes the raise easier, or it's time you'll wish you'd spend differently. The developers who raise capital consistently and on good terms are almost never the ones with the best projects. They're the ones who started the relationship earliest.
So summarizing this a little bit, it sounds like raising capital isn't a transaction. It's a relationship management process. And and
Absolutely right.
and perhaps that's something that we just don't talk about enough. Investors don't write checks because the spreadsheet looks pretty. They write checks because they believe in what the team can deliver. And we talk about the human
Exactly.
side of this industry, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've talked about on previous episodes is that our industry is maturing now, right? We're moving beyond just simply producing RNG, and we're starting to think about how to maximize the value of every molecule. And that brings us to a project that recently caught my attention. Your project, right? The Global Energy Renewables Distillery Project
Mhm.
in Kentucky. And what fascinated me wasn't just the RNG production. It was the way the project was designed around multiple value streams: RNG, food grade CO2, environmental attributes, optionality. Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about the thinking behind that project?
Yeah, I mean, what I find fascinating about projects like this, and it's something that I think both Chris and I, as a company, we've become more deliberate about over the years, is the difference between a project that produces one thing and a project that's designed to produce value from everything, lots of different income streams
Mhm.
across the pitch, as it were. Um, the distillery waste to RNG model is, I think, a beautiful example of the second, really. Every output that used to be a cost or a disposal problem becomes a revenue stream. And that's fundamentally different. That's a fundamentally different way of thinking about project design as much as anything. I think when you look at distillery waste feedstocks, that starting point that changes everything. You start with the feedstock and you immediately understand why this works. I mean, distilleries produce enormous amounts of organic waste, the stillage, the spent grain, processed water, and that traditionally costs money to manage and dispose of. But when you reframe it, that you reframe that waste as the input to an anaerobic digestion process, you've done something quite elegant, for want of a bad way of putting it. You've turned a liability into an asset, and that's because the feedstock is a byproduct of an established industrial operation, I guess. You have a consistency and a predictability that you don't get with other organic waste streams. That reliability matters enormously when you're financing a project, that's for sure. I think the other part to look at around this is revenue diversification, and it's a process of engineering resilience into the structure. The single revenue stream model in energy projects has always made me, I suppose, a little bit cautious. You're entirely exposed to one market, one price, one set of policy conditions. What excited me, and I'm sure I speak for Chris in this as well, I think what's exciting is that the thinking behind projects like this, that the revenue diversification isn't an afterthought, it's designed into the process from the beginning. So you have the RNG itself, you have the environmental attributes, the renewable identification numbers, the low carbon fuel standard credits, you have the CO2 recovery. What else have we got? And you have potential tipping fee revenue from the feedstock itself. Each of those streams has a different risk characteristics, different market dynamics, but together they create a project that's, I think, is a genuinely resilient. It's generally resilient in a way that a single market project simply isn't, to be honest with you.
So historically, developers ask, can I inject the gas into a pipeline? Today, it feels like they're asking, where does the molecule create the most value?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right way to frame it,
Mm.
to be honest with you. And the shift between those two questions represents something I think is quite profound in its way, not just in how projects are developed, but in how value is understood in the energy transition. Just to elaborate on that, the pipeline question is an engineering question. The molecule question is a strategic one. And I think the developers who are asking the second question are more often than not operating in a completely different league, to be honest with you. The pipeline question was the right question for its time. To be fair, for a long time, the pipeline was the answer. If you get your RNG to pipeline specification, inject it, you had a market, you had a price, you had a financeable project. The infrastructure existed, the regulatory framework was understood, the offtake was relatively straightforward. Happy days. That model worked and it brought an enormous amount of capital into the sector, but it was essentially a commodity mindset, I suppose. Produce the molecule, deliver it into the system, take the market price, the values in the volume. And it was quite a simplistic, binary sort of viewpoint. I think the molecule question is more of a value optimization question. So what's changed is the recognition that the same molecule can be worth fundamentally different amounts depending upon where it goes and what it displaces. RNG injected into a general pipeline and used for heating has one value. That same molecule used as a transportation fuel in a heavy-duty fleet in a low-carbon fuel standard state has a dramatically different value because of the carbon intensity of what it's replacing and the regulatory credits that it generates. The molecule hasn't changed, it's just that the destination has. And increasingly sophisticated developers are designing projects around destination first as much as anything. I think the other thing to say is on the basis of carbon intensity, that made the molecule multi-dimensional. The emergence of carbon intensity as a pricing mechanism is what really unlocked this thinking. Once you attach a carbon score to a molecule, once the value of the fuel becomes a function, not just of its energy content, but of its entire life cycle carbon profile, you create a situation where routing decisions have enormous financial consequences. So a molecule, say, with a very low or negative carbon intensity score delivered into the right market can generate environmental attributes that dwarf the commodity value of the gas itself. And that completely changes the calculus of project design, really, I think, as much as anything. The best developers now think like traders, not just producers. And what I find really fascinating is that the best development teams today are thinking about molecule routing, the way sophisticated commodity traders think about arbitrage. So where is the demand? Where is the carbon intensity differential greatest? Where are the policy incentives deepest? Which off-takers will pay a premium for verified low carbon molecules. That's a fundamentally different skill set from traditional project development. And the teams that have built that capability alongside their engineering and financing expertise are the ones creating the most interesting projects right now, I would say. I think optionality becomes a core design principle, and this brings you back to project design. So if you know that the value of your molecule depends on its destination and that those markets will continue to evolve, then you design your project to preserve as much routing flexibility as possible. You think about which offtake markets you commit to and for how long. You think about infrastructure investments that open future options rather than close them down. You think about how your carbon intensity score might improve over time and what that unlocks. The pipeline question had one answer. The molecule question just keeps generating waves of new ones, that's for sure. And the best projects are built to, I suppose, keep asking you, really.
And that brings us to one of the biggest shifts, I think, that's happening in the industry. Like a few years ago, most project models were built around a single destination for RNG, and that was specifically to the vehicle and fuel market. And now while we're still injecting gas into the same pipelines, we're talking about many different destinations, the Canadian CFR, renewable LNG, marine fuel, using it to help produce sustainable aviation fuel. And then we're also looking at these other markets, like carbon capture and bio CO2. And given how these markets keep ebbing and flowing and changing, how much are they influencing development decisions that people are making today?
Well, to be honest with you, Scott, I think what you're describing is the difference between a market and an ecosystem. And a few years ago, RNG developers were navigating one market with just a few pricing variables. Now, you look at it today, I mean, today they're navigating a great interconnected set of markets and routeways and what have you, each with its own carbon intensity requirements, its own regulatory architecture, its own offtake dynamics. And the honest answer is that the best development teams aren't just being influenced by those markets. They're designing projects around the optionality of being able to access several of them at a time, to be honest with you. I mean, you look at the CFR, the Canadian CFR markets, the clean fuels regulations in Canada opened something genuinely significant. Suddenly you had a second major carbon pricing jurisdiction with deep demand for low carbon molecules and its own credit pricing mechanism, I should say. For US developers with strong carbon intensity projects, that created an immediate question: is my molecule worth more here or there? The ability to access Canadian CFR markets alongside LCFS has introduced a genuine arbitrage dynamic into development thinking. Projects that might have been marginal in one jurisdiction suddenly become compelling when you model dual market access. And that's a structural change as much as anything, and not a temporary one. When it comes to renewable LNG, that's where things get genuinely interesting from an infrastructure perspective. You have liquefaction that opens up demand that's completely inaccessible. SAF is where I think the conversation gets the most exciting and most complex simultaneously. You have the carbon intensity requirements for aviation are very stringent, exceptionally so, to be honest with you, which means not every molecule qualifies, but the ones that do command extraordinary premiums. The pathway from biogas to SAF, which is something that Chris and I are involved in at the moment, is technically involved. So you're typically talking about power to liquids or specific upgrading processes. But the value at the end of that pathway reflects the difficulty. Airlines are under, as we all know, they're under enormous pressure at the moment from regulators, from investors and passengers to decarbonise. And they will pay for credible low carbon fuel in a way that very few other off-takers will. So for projects with the right feedstock profile, the right carbon intensity credentials, SAF is the highest value destination on the board right now. And I think also from a perspective of carbon capture and bio CO2, we touched on this with the distillery project, but it deserves a bit of emphasis in this context. The maturation of carbon markets and the emergence of bio CO2 as a recognized commodity have added dimensions to project economics that just didn't exist a few years ago, to be honest with you. Carbon capture attached to a biogenic source creates the potential for carbon negative outcomes. And in a world where corporate net zero commitments are driving voluntary carbon market demand, that brings real monetary value. The bio CO2 piece is compelling. You've got food grade CO2 from a renewable biogenic source that commands a premium over industrial CO2, and demand is growing. They're not peripheral revenue streams anymore. In the right project, they can be the margin that makes the difference between fundable and not fundable.
So are the developers beginning to design projects differently because of these opportunities?
I think they are, to be honest with you. We're certainly seeing it. I think, Chris, it's safe to say that we've seen more and more examples of that, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from our projects in the United States, we now have a look at a whole host of different logistics options because of this. So not necessarily just proximity to a pipeline. Obviously, that makes a large contributing factor to it, but things like railway siding, so we can move liquids over a longer distance, even potentially waterways. We're looking at moving some RNG via via barge up the Mississippi and round on the Ohio for a project, which is quite exciting. Certainly not something we have to design in the UK for that side of things. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that developers are certainly taking these into, shall we say, forward-thinking developers are certainly taking these into consideration when designing their projects. It's not just putting it just into the pipeline. My view, I must admit, is that putting RNG into pipelines is a bit like having a stone wheel, and there's so much more that we can be doing this now, either making it into liquefied natural gas or into SAF. There's a whole host of things that we can be doing, and yeah, a smart developer will be designing with these future pathways in place.
So it sounds like the conversation more than ever needs to be around flexibility. You know, a few years ago, most projects were designed around like that singular outcome. And today we are talking about all of these different pathways. Um, how is that changing the way developers are thinking about projects from day one now?
Well, I think what you're really describing is a fundamental shift in the unit of project design. I mean, a few years developers started with a destination and built backwards. But today, the best developers start with the molecule, so its origin, its carbon profile, its potential pathways, and then design the project to keep as many doors open as possible for as long as possible. And that's not a subtle refinement. You know, that's a completely different design philosophy. Certainly, I think flexibility. Yeah, if I was to summarize it, flexibility is now engineered in. It's not added later. The most important change both Chris and I are seeing now is that flexibility has moved from being what was almost an afterthought, really, as much as anything, to being a core engineering requirement. In the old model, at the risk of sounding too venerable, in the old days, you designed for your destination, so pipeline spec, injection point, offtake agreement, and everything else followed on from that. Nowadays, sophisticated developers are asking at the earliest stage, what infrastructure investments preserve our future options rather than foreclose them? Where do we site the liquefaction capability? How do we design the upgrading process to accommodate future pathways? What does the CO2 offtake infrastructure need to look like if the carbon markets deepen? You know, it becomes more of a multi-dimensional, multi-layered set of considerations. Those are day one conversations now as much as anything. And the projects that don't have them at day one pay a significant premium to retrofit them or retrofit that flexibility later if they can at all. So that's an incredibly important consideration. I think as far as the financial model is concerned, that has fundamentally changed. This changes project finance in ways that are still being worked through by the market. I think as much as anything, traditionally lenders always just wanted simplicity, one revenue stream, one offtake counterparty, one market, clean, understandable, financeable. But the multi-pathway model is way more complex now to underwrite. And I think the thing that is shifting is sophisticated lenders and equity investors are beginning to recognize that the complexity of a well-designed multi-pathway project is actually lower risk than the simplicity of a single destination project. Ostensibly, I guess, because concentration risk is real risk. You know, a project with 5 revenue pathways and the infrastructure to access them is going to be far more resilient than a project with just one, even if the modeling is a bit harder. So I think the market is catching up to that understanding. As it does, multi-pathway projects are what we see is they're accessing better and better capital on better and better terms, certainly. I think as far as site selection is concerned, geography used to be primarily a feedstock question. Where is the organic waste? Where is the grid connection? Where is the pipeline? Nowadays, site selection carries an entirely new set of considerations. So is there port access for marine fuel, maybe, or renewable LNG distribution? What is the proximity to aviation fuel infrastructure, the future SAF pathways? Is the location in a jurisdiction with strong carbon pricing that rewards low-intensity molecules? What does the CO2 transport storage look like for carbon capture optionality? Lots and lots of different questions. And I've seen development teams spend as much time on infrastructure mapping as on feedstock assessment, because they understand that where you build determines which doors are open to you and which, unfortunately, sometimes can be permanently closed. And I think probably just in summarizing, I would say, the bottom line is that flexibility used to be a luxury that projects could afford to think about once the core economics were established. Today, it's an absolute necessity that has to be embedded in the project from the first conversation, because markets are moving. They're moving very, very quickly, as we all know, and the policy environment is evolving. Technologies are maturing faster than any single project can really anticipate or accommodate sometimes. So the developers who build for one outcome are making a 30-year bet on conditions that may not persist for 5 years, may not exist in 5 years. The ones who build for flexibility, they're the ones who are designing projects that can create value, whatever the energy transition looks like in 10, 20 or 30 years' time.
Yeah, Chris, I'd love to get the lender perspective, because when we're talking about these, newer pathways, so to speak, like the SAF and marine fuel, like where's the balance in bringing these emerging markets forward that makes projects more attractive versus just creating, additional uncertainty? We talked about it earlier. Lenders love certainty. So like how do you navigate that balancing act?
Yeah, certainly. From a lending perspective, they are becoming more au fait with SAF, marine fuel, Canadian CFR. We do get quite a few questions on the CFR things around floating prices and being able to fix them in. That is one risk that gets highlighted quite regularly. But SAF and marine fuel, they're not necessarily looking from a lender. They're not looking at the bankability of who you're selling it to, but actually who are they selling it to. And that's where it really makes a difference, because you're then talking to your United Airlines, your British Airways, massive companies that have certainly got the balance sheet to be able to support these transactions. In the marine fuel, you're looking at Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM, for example. So there's, big companies out there that are buying this advanced fuels, we'll call them, that takes out the uncertainty aspect of it. In fact, if anything, it eliminates some of the potential political uncertainty. Emerging markets, I would treat with an element of caution, around market maturity. Are you giving a 10-year contract to actually a market that might not be there in 10 years? Whereas SAF and marine fuels have had a lot longer to mature and to stabilize and become a recognized pathway for RNG to go into. So I would certainly treat anything outside of the sort of conventional advanced fuels with an element of caution. But certainly lenders are quite in tune with marine fuels and SAF and the Canadian CFR markets as we sit here today.
So at what point does optionality become complexity?
So from our perspective, it's all around the sort of, can they still underwrite a base case? Is there something there that, they can still sit down and go, yes, this hits our returns if none of these other parts work? If it's clean and it's got a fundable core underneath it, then it makes a lot of sense. We've looked at projects here in the UK where you'll do your RNG facility to go into the tariff, but have the bio-LNG as a phase 2 optionality side. And investors are okay with that because the base case stands alone and the upside and the option is an upside. Where I think developers can go wrong is taking that upside and making that the side. They're taking and sort of going away from in the US, your RINs, your LCFS credits, etc., stripping out the elements that we know work and going too far, too quick, and taking out the certainty, shall we say. And I think that's when investors can't price it, and that's where it gives a real issue to them around that sort of optionality to complexity, if that makes sense, Lisa. If you can state each of your positions in a single sentence and what triggers it and what makes that deal and does the deal work without them, then that's optionality. But if you need a diagram to explain how the pieces intersect, how the base case leans onto them, it's already too complex. And complexity is priced as risk and not as value. And as soon as you're starting to price risk, then two things are going to happen. Your project's either not going to stand up, or you're going to be taking a lot of it away. They're going to be taking a lot of it away from you. And I guess it depends on your appetite as a developer, whether you're happy with that, or, you know, if you just want to actually present options to them rather than making it too complex. There are what you offer the investor who asks, what else can this do? But it's never the answer to why does this work?
Yeah, and I would fully endorse what Chris says there, to be honest with you. I think the way I think about it is optionality is a tool, not a strategy. You know, used with discipline, it makes projects stronger, more resilient, more attractive to sophisticated capital. I think used without discipline, it creates projects that try to be everything and end up being nothing particularly well, which is, you know, obviously to be avoided at all costs. I think the question every developer needs to ask honestly is, am I preserving this option because it creates genuine value for the project, or is it because it feels safer than committing?
So do you think we're moving towards a future where developers start with the markets, right? Like they design a project around what market they're serving. So instead of just saying, I have a molecule, they're saying, I have a demand, and now I need a project that's capable of serving it.
Yeah, I think the center of gravity has shifted. If I'm honest with you, the market now leads the project, not the molecule. Developers who start with demand signals are the ones getting funded and contracted and scaled for sure. The old model was I have a molecule. So for years, biogas and RNG development was supply-led. So developers built digesters because feedstock was available. Then they went looking for offtake. Projects were engineered first and then kind of commercialized second. That world has gone. Investors won't back it and corporates won't contract it. So the new model is I have demand, now I need a project. So today the market is putting projects into existence. So industrial buyers want baseload biomethane. Tech companies want long-term carbon negative molecules, and heavy transport wants drop-in bio-LNG, and utilities as well. Utilities want grid injected RNG with guaranteed attributes. And I think these buyers are signing multi-year offtake agreements before a project is even designed more often than not. So that flips the development sequence, I think. And why is the shift happening? Well, you can probably highlight three forces. Institutional capital wants scale, wants repeatability, and contracted revenue. Corporates need guaranteed decarbonisation molecules, not theoretical supply. And policy is rewarding verified carbon intensity, not just production volume. So, developers are now reverse engineering projects around CI scores, delivery profile, geographic proximity, feedstock aggregation, long-term offtake requirements. And that's, I suppose, as much as anything, that's platform thinking, not single asset thinking. I think what that means for the sector is you make the winners in RNG and bio-LNG will be the developers who behave like infrastructure platforms, aggregating feedstock, standardizing engineering, and building projects around contracted demand. It positions you as someone who understands where the market is actually going, I think, in that sort of situation.
So, Chris, let's put your lender's hat back on. Walk us through a typical RNG capital stack.
So there's two fundamentals when it comes to the capital stack, and that is the equity portion and the debt portion. And they can come in many different guises. Debt can be considered as bank debt, private activity bonds, whereas equity is either put in from an equity investor who will demand higher returns, and therefore that's what means that a model goes from an unlevered investor rate of return up to a levered one when you put the equity piece in, or it could indeed be the developer's own equity. On the equity side, you may find a situation where you have both a main equity provider and then sort of a mezzanine equity provider as well, where it doesn't quite cover the ticket and you can't get the loan to value of the debt up as well. So they would be the two fundamentals. Then split the equity out into a portion as well, but you can also have mezzanine debt as well in case your bonds or the bank loans won't meet the full portion and you can't get the equity down. You have almost like a little grey area in the middle where you can do a blend of mezzanine equity, mezzanine debt as well. And then in the United States, you have tax credits as well, which are obviously bankable once you've built the project, and then you can leverage those production tax credits to help finance part of the project as well, Skye.
And what metrics matter most?
So this is one that we actually recently covered in our masterclass, that it comes down to the investor rate of return as a hurdle rate. If you're not covering that, then you're not getting over that first bridge into the investment committee. You've got your debt service coverage ratio, and where that hits on a coverage of the debt, and most will want nothing below a 1.1 times coverage. The higher, the better. That also feeds into covering your cash flow. You don't want to be in a particular situation where your cash flow falls negative. And then most lenders will run a couple of different sensitivities as well, around delays or policy delays, payment delays. Then they'll do an ultimate one where pretty much everything goes wrong. And that's not to say this is how we break the project, but should everything go wrong, where do we stand? It's quite an interesting part that we covered off called a tornado analysis, and it ranks how the metrics actually impact on the bankability of a project. So that's where we see the main areas that are the metrics: the IRR, the debt service coverage ratio, and then those sensitivity analysis as well.
So let's just use a really simple example. Say I have a $40 million RNG project, 70% debt, 30% equity. Walk us through who gets paid first and how investors think about returns.
So from who gets paid first and who gets paid last, it's whoever comes in last. So in most cases, this is the equity provider. So the last ones in are also the last ones out. So typically the developer will put the equity in, or an equity provider. They'll also be the people that get paid last. So when it comes to a capital stack, the debt, the senior debt especially, will come in first, and they'll be the first to be paid. Then you'll go to your mezzanine or your junior debt. They will then be paid. So out of our example, say we've got a split of 50 million as senior debt, they would get covered first. Then 20 million as junior debt, they would then get paid. And then the remaining 30 million would be the element that gets paid out last. And that is either through an equity investor or can be through the sponsor. And if you have that split between equity from a co-investor and equity from a sponsor, unfortunately, the sponsors are the ones that get paid last. So it's a complex beast putting this together and understanding who gets paid when. But the easy way of putting it is senior debt is in first, lowest cost, and the first ones to get paid, going through the mezzanine section of the stack, and then it will come out to the equity portion. So that's where they desire a higher return, but they'll also be the last ones to put their money in, but the last ones to take it out at the same time.
Makes absolute sense. So Andrew, when the market shifts or projects underperform, what options do the owners have?
Well, I would say when markets shift or projects underperform, owners actually have more options than they probably think, to be honest with you. The key is to treat the asset like part of a broader platform, not like a standalone project, I suppose, as much as anything. The four levers for consideration are refinancing, restructuring, portfolio optimization, and strategic repositioning. And each one can fundamentally alter the trajectory of a project, for sure. I think on the refinancing side of things, owners can unlock breathing room or accelerate growth by either extending the tenor to reduce cash flow pressure, converting short-term or construction debt into long-term infrastructure capital. They can bring in cheaper institutional money once the project stabilizes. They can monetize contracted offtake through creditworthy counterpart structures. That's often the fastest way to turn a stressed project around into a bankable one. On the restructuring side, well, when performance diverges from the original plan, restructuring allows owners to reset the project, so recutting feedstock agreements, re-engineering the plant to improve the CI score or output, renegotiating offtake terms, for example, bringing in a new operating partner, or adjusting ownership or governance. I think the key thing to remember is restructuring is not a failure. It's a normal part of scaling waste to value assets. When it comes to portfolio optimization, and this is where owners start thinking like platforms, certainly divesting non-core or underperforming assets. You can consolidate feedstock across multiple sites. It can be the standardization of technology and operations and management. And the other thing that could be considered is reallocating capital towards the highest return projects. So optimization, I would say, turns a collection of assets into a coherent and investable platform. I think from the point of view of strategic repositioning, sometimes the market has just simply moved. And the project will need to move with it. So that could be shifting from electricity to biomethane, upgrading from biomethane to bioLNG, maybe targeting new offtake sectors like transport, industrial, utilities, reorienting the towards carbon negative production and CI-driven revenue is another consideration. So I think this is where owners capture upside rather than just perhaps sometimes defend the downside. I think as much as anything. And I think the most successful, overall in answer to that question, I think the most successful owners are the ones who treat change as an opportunity to realign the project with where the market is going, not where it used to be, for sure.
Well, we'll start doing a little lightning round. We've been doing this on most of our podcasts. And so just quick 1 or 2 word answers. And Chris, let's start with you. Technology or contracts?
Technology. If you choose the wrong technology, you won't deliver the numbers in your financial model.
Most common financing mistake?
Massively underplaying the need for contingency and what goes wrong.
One thing every lender wants to see?
Competent operators. And I'm sticking it at 2 words for that.
I like that.
Andrew, most underrated relationship skill?
I think the most underrated relationship skill is the ability to repair, not just to relate. Everyone talks about communication, empathy, and trust, but the real marker is how 2 people handle the moment after something goes wrong.
Mm-hmm. What's one thing developers should do before asking for money?
I would say before asking for money, developers should prove they understand their market, not just their technology. The single most important thing to do, I think, is to validate demand and show exactly who the project will serve and on what terms and why that buyer will commit.
Okay. Fastest way to build credibility?
I would say the fastest way to build it is to do exactly what you said you would do. So quickly, consistently, and without drama. Nothing beats delivered promises.
What's one thing that every project developer should remember during difficult markets?
I think every developer should remember that difficult markets don't kill good projects. They expose weak assumptions. And the developers who stay close to their demand, their feedstock and their numbers are the ones who survive and are able to then go forward and scale.
Great. Well, look, Chris, Andrew, it's been great having you on the podcast, and I've learnt loads. So before we go, what's the one piece of advice that you give somebody trying to move a project from concept to reality?
From my standpoint, it's if you don't have the core capabilities within your team, hire experts that do bring that to your function for you. If you try and fudge it, for want of better words. As Andrew said, the tough markets will expose that as a weakness very, very quickly. So bring in external experts to help plug those gaps.
I would say get external validation early, not a full contract, just one concrete signal. A buyer confirming the molecule you're proposing fits their decarbonisation strategy, a feedstock supplier confirming ability and pricing logic, and a lender confirming that the project sits within their mandate.
So my biggest takeaway from today's conversation is that project finance isn't really about spreadsheets. It's about trust. It's about aligning people, technology, markets, and capital around a common vision. And perhaps more importantly, it's understanding that every financing decision is ultimately a vote in confidence in a project's ability to create value over the long term. One of the things I've learned in this industry is that people often assume that projects were built with steel and concrete and compressors and membranes and pipelines. But before any of those things show up, somebody has to believe. A lender has to believe, an investor has to believe, a developer has to believe. And today's conversations remind me that project finance is really the art of creating confidence. Because when confidence, capital, technology, and execution come together, that's when great projects move from ideas on a whiteboard into real infrastructure, creating renewable energy, reducing emissions, strengthening communities, and creating value for generations. As our industry evolves into the Canadian CFR market, renewable LNG, marine fuel, SAF, carbon capture, bio CO2, and other opportunities we haven't even imagined yet, the projects that attract capital won't simply be technically sound. They'll be financially sound. They'll be strategically positioned. And they'll be led by teams that are capable of building confidence with investors, lenders, customers, and communities alike. And that's what this industry is all about.
And that's what makes this conversation really important.
So Chris, Andrew, thank you for joining us. And thank you to everyone who's listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, share it with a colleague, and send us your questions for future shows. Because the future of RNG isn't built solely with steel, concrete, compressors, and membranes and pipelines. It's built with people who are willing to invest in what's possible. And if you're interested in the masterclass that we have referenced several times on this show, the one I am personally currently taking, reach out to Chris Negus. His contact information will be in the show notes.
And we'll see you next time on the RNG Girls. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
It's been a pleasure.